Good morning. That's a light jacket for being outside. What? Okay, you're tough. It was a good morning for a nice hot cup of coffee. No, I've got water here, but I'm going to tell you all about the electronics that you're surrounded by. Well, the amazing thing is that it works as well as it does. You know, if I could give this by Zoom, I would too. It was cold outside. Oh, let me see if this is working. Oh, there it is, telephone. Okay, it does work. Well, Eve ordered me not to start before 10 o'clock. Give everybody a chance to come in. You know, I don't go to the gym to exercise because for me to walk from my house to the gym is exercise with a cane. Well, my philosophy is I'll do what I can do for as long as I can do it. You know, you'd stop at that point. Well, when I was still at the gym in Baltimore, I made the mistake of getting a personal trainer for a couple sessions. And this guy was less than half my age. And he didn't realize that he's half my age, twice as strong, and three times as durable. So I survived it, but it was quite a workout. Well, that and half of us have replacement parts. You know, Eve's got two artificial shoulders. I've still got all my original joints, but I attribute that to being a nerd and not a jock. So I didn't wear anything out. Yeah. The thing that amazed me when I had my reunion from high school, all the jocks, all the guys who played football and what have you, every one of them had a vertical chest scar. That had bypass surgery, and in those days you had your chest cracked. Now they're replacing valves, going in through the rib, and you don't have to crack a chest to do it. It's amazing. When you think about it, everything that was a wish when we were in training has come to pass. When you say, I wish I had, we've got it. There'll be what? Oh, yeah. Well, I was trained to do grafts using 7/0 silk, and now you got 13/0 nylon. You know, that's right. You can't even see it except under a microscope. But I have a picture of the original light machine made by Carl Zeiss to give us our intense beam of light before we had the laser. And it's the size of an armoire because you had a high intensity xenon bulb in there and this snout coming out with all the optics in it. And of course, it produced gobs of ozone, which gave everybody in the room a splitting headache. Those were the old days. Tell a what? Tell a woman? Okay. Yeah. When was the last time you had a telegram? And when was the last time you received a telegram? Can you even remember? Yeah. Eve, how was pickleball? Cold? Well, good morning. Right. Oh boy. There's coffee in the back if you want to get warmed up. No. Well, I told Pam if I could give this lecture on Zoom, I would. It's cold out there. Use what? Never used Loran, but I was never in the Navy. You know, it was for the ships and stuff. But I did use telex one time. And I mean, Loran is basically a type of radar, except it's for the ships, the long range detection. You need a couple of sources, and it's basically triangulation. You know, if you were a radio amateur and you were broadcasting on the wrong frequency, they could find you because all it took was three trucks with the directional antenna, and they knew where you were. Right. Well, all you needed was three, and with the satellites, four is the usual number. No, no, this is fine. Yeah, you can leave it like it is. I can see my notes. Well, I know what's up there, so I'll be okay. All right, well, it's a little bit after 10. And so what we're going to talk about today is electronics, which surround us. And they're more out there than we realize. We're not aware of most of them. But the list that you see up there is just what I could come up with off the top of my head. Of course, the telephone. As I say, when was the last time anybody received a telegram? So that's partly history. Telex I used in 1966, and it's still around. It's an old system, but it's still in use because it's secure and it's legally valid. And so people use it, especially maritime, between ships. Fax, I think the last fax I sent was about 2 years ago. But the rest of it, radio, TV, GPS, Wi-Fi, computers, batteries, we use all the time. We use them every day. And most of the time, we're not even aware that they're there. So if we go to the telephone, which is basic, we're all used to landline phones where you speak into the phone, your voice travels in sound waves. The sound waves are carried to a thin metal disc inside the phone. It's a diaphragm. And this gets converted into electrical energy. And so that goes over the wires to the central office, and then it's routed to the person you're calling at the other end. Your cell phone is basically a radio. So you do the same thing, you speak into it, it converts to electrical energy, but then it goes into a radio wave to a cell tower. And because of the frequency that it's used, it's line of sight. Lower frequencies would bounce off the Earth's atmosphere. So the so-called short wave you could use to talk to people around the world. But with the cell phones, because of the wavelength, the cell towers have to be line of sight. So you go from a cell tower to the central station, gets rerouted to another cell tower, which then talks to the phone of the person you're talking to. Early inventions, of course, Samuel Morse invented the telegraph, 1843. And then in 1876, Alexander Graham Bell with the telephone. And then finally, Thomas Edison with the phonograph. So these electronics haven't been around for that long. The telex is interesting. It uses the telephone system to send stuff around, but because it's secure, it's legal, it's still being used, as I mentioned, especially in the maritime industry. But it's been around. It was developed in the 1930s, and it's a real worldwide data communication system, which is now being slowly supplanted by the fax, the email, and SWIFT is the system used by the banks for commercial transactions. So the telex is gradually being phased out. But if we look at radio, the basic principle is to encode information on a radio wave. So you broadcast at a certain frequency, the receiver picks up the frequency, decodes it, and then gives you the information. So we have two types of radio, amplitude modulation and frequency modulation. So amplitude, you measure, you change the wave depending on the sound intensity. Frequency, you change the frequency. So here's what we've got. You've got a carrier wave at the top, which is your basic frequency. And then you've got a signal which you want to impose on that. With amplitude, you have the third one down. So basically your signal varies in loudness, gets louder or gets softer, and that's how it goes. With frequency, the loudness remains the same, but the pitch changes. So it gets either a higher pitch or a lower pitch. The advantage is a frequency modulation that it's pretty much resistant to static. Whereas, you know, in AM radio, you can get a fair amount of static. So what's going on is with AM radio, what frequency are we using? A little bit lower than about 1 million cycles per second. So if you remember your AM dial, it goes from 680 to 1300. The 680 is 680,000 cycles per second. And that's the range that's used. Frequency modulation uses a much higher range. And so it's up in the megahertz. So it's millions of cycles per second. And what I'm talking into the microphone is really quite a simple device. My sound waves go through this coating, and it's picked up by a flat metal diaphragm, which vibrates depending upon my speech. And the diaphragm is connected to a coil of wire, which has a magnet in its core. And so because the diaphragm moves, it moves this coil of wire along the magnet, and this generates an electrical impulse. So the electrical impulse goes out through the wire, and then it can be amplified. Now, in the back of the room, you've got a loudspeaker. So in place of the diaphragm, put a paper cone. So now we're going in reverse. We're taking the electricity into the coil. It's going to move this paper cone. It's going to push against the air in the room and generate sound. So if you have a Wi-Fi setup at home, and you can take the front of it off to actually see the paper cone. If you're playing a very low frequency note, you'll actually see this thing move. But that's how it works. Basically, your loudspeaker is your microphone in reverse. now we're getting to the nitty-gritty, to television. And the basics are you've got a TV camera, it turns a picture and sound into a signal, and this gets transmitted through the air. And then your TV receiver captures a signal, converts it back to sound and a picture. Now, we're all old enough to remember the original TV sets. They were basically modified oscilloscopes. The oscilloscope has been used in the lab for many, many years to see things like how a current looks, how the wave of the electricity. But we discovered that if we put a signal into it, we could generate a picture. So what is the cathode ray oscilloscope? Basically, it's a big radio tube. In the back, you've got a cathode, which electrons are streaming out of because you put a big negative charge on it. And these electrons are aiming toward the front of the tube, which is coated with a phosphor. So when the electrons hit it, it glows. And it's set up so that this electron beam runs across the surface of the tube. So in the old electrodes in the original TV sets, this occurred 525 times. So you had 525 lines across the front of the TV set. And the phosphor doesn't give you a very sharp picture. It's not bad, but it's a little fuzzy at the edges. And the original TV sets were basically big cathode ray tubes. Of course, they were in black and white. And then Sony came out with the Triniton, because that was the first color TV set. And what it was basically 3 black and white sets put together. So you had 3 electron guns there, each aiming a primary color. So the beam that it hit a phosphor that was that color. And that's how we got the first color TV. It was quite expensive, as you might imagine. And then we developed the flat screen TVs, and this worked on an entirely different principle. Instead of having an electron beam sweep across the screen, you now had the electron beam or some way of hitting a little pocket of material, like a liquid crystal or a small LED. So basically, if you look at your big screen TV, imagine millions of dots equally spaced across it, each one of which is capable of producing either a color or black and white. And that's how it basically works. And so you don't need a huge radio tube. The biggest cathode ray TVs were probably close to 30 inches. And they were really pieces of furniture because these tubes were quite large. Well, now you've got these enormous TV sets because you're not scanning a beam of electrons across a screen. What you have is millions of these tiny little cells, and they're getting smaller all the time due to technology. So basically, you get a very sharp picture. And the problem is, what do you use to produce it? Well, the original was a liquid crystal, which was so-so, but at least it was flat. Then we came up with a plasma, which is basically an ionized plasma gas in a small cell, and it was a little bit better. And then we came up with the light-emitting diodes. And these were increased in contrast, the picture was better, they were thinner, and because they were semiconductors, they had a longer lifespan. And the TV today, the top of the line, is the organic LED, which is just an improvement. And so what we have are these enormous TV sets with very good color, high contrast, dark blacks, and we expect them to last a long time because they're solid state. And it is complicated. So if you look at what an OLED TV looks like, you've got these layers. Basically, you're aiming an electron from the back to the front. It's going through all these layers to give you that picture. And I'm not going to go into how it does it. But basically, that's the technology that we're enjoying. And it's going to get better still because the LEDs are getting smaller, the TVs are getting sharper, and we're going to have them bigger still. So if you look at the stadia where they have these enormous TVs, that's the technology that's producing this. Well, we all, I think, have computers, but we haven't been around for that long. And they started out as calculating machines, The original computers were analog. They had vacuum tubes, and they had so many vacuum tubes to produce the computer that the heat from the vacuum tube heated the building the computer was in, and they weren't very powerful. We got digital computers because of World War II. There was a problem. If you aimed an anti-aircraft gun at an airplane, frequently you missed. It was hard. You had to have a direct hit to knock it down. But the engineers figured that if the shell was close enough to the airplane and you had a little radar set in the shell and had the shell explode, you could knock down that plane. So you did much better. And so they went to Bell Labs. They said, make us a radar set we can put into an anti-aircraft shell. Well, no radio tube can withstand the shock of being fired from an anti-aircraft gun. So radio tubes are out. And the people at Bell Labs really invented the transistor for this purpose. And the transistor is a semiconductor device. It's basically two semiconductors of different varieties butting on each other, and a third semiconductor on top, sort of like a brick, a series of two bricks with the brick on top straddling the two. And with that arrangement, you could make an amplifier. So you could make your radar set. And so Bell Lab invented the transistor, and it was very successful. The proximity fuse worked, and the increase in airplanes that were knocked down was considerable. Well, there's one problem with the transistors. They only know either on or off. So all of a sudden, you have to develop a digital math to figure out how to use these things. Well, that was done for us around the middle of 1850 or so by a fellow in Britain named George Boole. Apparently he had nothing to do after dinner one night, so he developed a digital math. And so it was just a math curiosity until transistors came along, and now we needed it. So because transistors are using logic, which is simply zeros or ones. Well, that's hard for a human to comprehend. And then some human genius figured out it's easier to teach a computer English or French or German or Spanish than it is to teach a human binary math. And so how did we do that? Well, we have a thing called a compiler. So we started a high-level language like English, and it translates into a language that the computer can understand. So if I want to tell the computer the letter A, I say A, what does the computer hear? 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0. So we're going from A to that series of ones and zeros. And that's how it's done. So if we look at today's computer, we've got hardware at the bottom. We've got an operating system, which is how the computer works. We then have an application on top of that, which is something we want to do. And then we have us, the user. So what are all these components? Well, the hardware is the guts of the computer. The motherboard is the board that holds all these chips and all these connectors. It's the screen, the keyboard, that's your hardware. Then you have firmware. These are chips in which a certain amount of intelligence has been put in, and this is the software that makes it work. And that changes periodically by the company. So my Dell computer frequently gets its firmware upgraded by Dell. And so what it's doing is sending a program to this series of chips, which are then remembering what it is. The BIOS is basic input-output system, and that's what gets all the parts working together. So the hardware can talk to my printer, can talk to my mouse, can talk to my keyboard. And then we have the operating system so humans can run it. And then we have the programs to do all the stuff we want to do. We want to communicate, so we have an email and a browser. We have a word processor because nobody wants to write anymore with a pencil or a pen. We have a spreadsheet to do the numbers, databases to remember things, and then things like the PowerPoint I'm using here. So if you look at your computer, you have your input devices, your keyboard, and your mouse, and maybe a joystick, scanner, a camera, a microphone, and then your output devices, your screen, your printer, your loudspeaker, earphones, or maybe a projector. So how do you use it? Well, you use a word processor to write text, your spreadsheet to manipulate your numbers, your database to keep track of things, your communications program, and those four are the basics that every computer has that you buy today. But you can do more. You can find directions using your GPS. You can play games. It has maps. You can manipulate pictures using a program like Photoshop. And more importantly today, we do electronic banking using credit cards and debit cards, and this all involves computers. And the key and the brain to the computer is this thing called a microprocessor, or the central processing unit. And this was developed by Intel in 1971. And the first microprocessor was the 4004. And it was named that way because it had 4 data lines coming in and 4 going out. Now that's in contrast to today's microprocessor, which has 64 data lines coming in and going out. The Intel 404 ran at about 2 megahertz. Today's processor runs at 3 gigahertz, or 1,000 times faster. So in the course of 50 years or more, we've made considerable progress. So what is this thing actually doing? Well, basically, it's just adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. And the first microprocessors and the first computer did just that. It was basically a calculator. Now, because of the power, they can do a lot of other things. They have a lot more instructions, and we use them in just about everything. Now, the other thing that happened was technology. We managed to make these smaller and smaller, and we can use transistors to do almost anything electronically. And so with each passing year, the chips got more powerful. You now have literally millions of transistors on each chip. And now we have chips that have multiple things, multiple processors. So when you look at your computer and you see that it's an i3 or an i5 or an i7, what does that mean? It means you've got 3 or 5 or 7 microprocessors on that one chip. So it's like having 3 computers. So, but what is it really doing? Well, it's hardware and software components, and it works by receiving data through an input and based on instructions that it has or that are given from the operating system. It processes the data and sends it back through the output. So the microprocessor is really a very complicated chip. The main units are the control unit, which is really the brain, and decides what everything is going on. The microprocessor has a thing called microcode in it, which starts up as soon as electrical power is supplied to the chip. And what it does, it gets the chip ready to receive information. So there's a certain part of the chip called registers, which receive information and handle information and store it. And so it says, okay, clear out all the registers to 0, and now get the first instruction from the operating system. Then you have the arithmetic logic unit. And this is the unit, the part of the microprocessor that does the work. This is the part that's adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. And then you have other operations that it can do, logic operations, like if, then what. And we do the same thing. So if I have an if-then instruction, if I go to Treats and Treasures and give the lady behind the counter $2, then she will give me a cup of coffee. So I'm doing basically what the computer's doing, just a little bit differently. But the computer can handle these instructions because they're built in. And today's computers, today's microprocessors chips have a lot of instructions built into them. They're very complex chips. They require specialized facilities to make them. And the expense of a facility to make a microprocessor chip now is about $5 billion because it requires super clean rooms and very specialized equipment. You need to know about Taiwan Semiconductor because that's the company in Taiwan that produces the most sophisticated chips. Interestingly enough, the equipment that they use is made in the Netherlands. So this is a worldwide process, but Taiwan Semiconductor produces the chips for Apple and NVIDIA, and they're the leading company in the world producing these super sophisticated chips. Well, now let's talk about Wi-Fi and internet. What is it? Well, Wi-Fi is really basically just a radio, and it's a short-range radio. So you communicate with your router by Wi-Fi. If you have a wireless printer, your computer is talking to your printer by a radio wave, so your printer works. The same thing if you have a wireless mouse. The internet is the connection between all these computers. It's wired, and it's worldwide cables, fiber optics to connect this whole system together. So Wi-Fi is your local, and the internet is the global system of all these computers connected together. Next, we go to GPS. We use it, we enjoy it. What's going on? Well, there are 4 systems now. The GLONASS system is the Russian system. The GPS is our system. Galileo is the European system. And China has just come up with their own system now. And so there's another 40 to 50 satellites up there, which the Chinese are putting up for their system. But GPS works because you've got 3 components. You've got a ground station, which is basically a radar station. You have a satellite, which is in geocentric orbit with the Earth. And that means it's moving as fast as the Earth is moving. And so basically it's staying in one place in relation to the Earth. And they actually move a little bit, but basically they're staying in the same place. And then you have a receiver, which is either in your car or your cell phone. And these are talking to each other all the time. So the satellites act, we know where they are at any given time. The ground stations use radar to make sure they are where they think they are. And these systems are always producing a radar signal. Now there's a problem, and that is that a satellite away from the Earth has a clock in it, but that clock runs a little bit faster than the clock that's here on Earth because gravity affects the speed of a clock. That was something that Einstein figured many years ago. And so it has to have a clock in the satellite and a clock on Earth that's fast enough and accurate enough to detect that very tiny difference. And it does. And so what you have, if you want to find out where you are, you have to go at least 3, usually 4 of these satellites, and they triangulate. And so they know how far away they are from the Earth or where your receiver is. They know where the next satellite over is, and that satellite also is trying to find you. And so if you've got 4 of these, they can pinpoint exactly where you are. And the technology is such that they know where you are to within probably an inch. They're that good. So here's what we've got just over us. This is a map of about 88 satellites that are just for the GPS system. There's a lot of other satellites out there for other different uses, but these are just the GPS satellites. There's lots of them. And the one in about the middle of the screen is the one that flies over Gainesville. So we've got, I guess if you have the appropriate telescope, you can look up in the sky and see our satellite. But that's what's out there, and that's what we use so that wherever you go in the world, you can use this system. Now, as I said, you need a clock, and you need one that's a little bit more accurate than a Rolex. So we use an atomic clock. And the way that works is if you send energy into an atom, the electron will be kicked up to a higher energy state. And then, of course, it falls back, and you can detect that. But how fast does it have to go? Well, we use cesium atoms, and we find that we have to put enough energy in, and the energy level drops in a 9 billionth of a second. So the cesium clock ticks at over 9 billion cycles per second. That's pretty accurate. And I think they figured out it loses a half a second a century. So it's a pretty good clock. But that you need a clock that accurate to detect the quantum difference between what the satellite is and where the ground is. But we take all this for granted because it all works in the background. But that's what the technology is. Now, we talk about electricity, but most of our electricity is still generated by steam turbines. So if we look at what we've got, solar is only 3%. The wind is 10%, and water, hydroelectric, is really only 6%. So most of our electricity is generated one way or another by steam turbines. Now, how we get that steam, 19% or 20% coal, about another 18% nuclear, and then a little bit by natural gas, but about 80% relies on the steam turbines one way or another. Now, electricity is interesting because of how we've got the system that we have. There was a battle between Edison and Tesla figured out that the most efficient electricity was 240 volts at about 60 hertz or 60 cycles per second. And Edison was unhappy with that because he said, you know, that's kind of dangerous. It's dangerous to humans, it's dangerous to animals. He said 120 volts is a lot safer. And Edison made his point by taking 240 volts and electrocuting a few animals to demonstrating that 240 was really kind of dangerous. Well, most of Europe and the rest of the world didn't have a problem with 240 volts. But in this country, we're on 110. The other battle was between Edison and George Westinghouse over whether we should have AC or DC current. And AC won out simply because it's easier to transmit long distances. You can't transmit direct current very far without losing a good bit of it. And so we now have 120 volts alternating current in this country. Europe has 220 to 240 alternating, and it alternates between 50 and 60 cycles per second. That's not much of a problem. If you're on a 50 cycle system, you may see some lights flicker, but it's not really much of a problem. And so if we go to our next thing, which is batteries, which we take for granted, and they're everywhere. And they're places where you don't think they are. But there's basically two types of batteries, those that are not chargeable and those that can be charged. So we're all used to the old zinc carbon battery, which is the original flashlight battery. And that's been around quite a long time. It was developed in 1866. Alkaline batteries came in 1959. And then we have the silver oxide batteries, which commonly called button cells. And they were invented by Volta way back when, but they didn't become practical until the 1940s. And these little silver oxide batteries are everywhere. You just don't know they're there. If you're wearing a watch, that it's a quartz watch, you've got one of these little batteries in your watch. Your garage door opener has one of these batteries in it. If you have a digital scale, it's got a battery in it. If you have an electronic blood pressure cuff, it's got these batteries in it. They are everywhere. You just don't see them. Then we have the rechargeable batteries, the lead acid, which is an old battery invented in 1859 The nickel cadmium is a considerable improvement, but we came in 1899. But we never used it much, even though it was a much superior battery. And then the lithium batteries came in around 1976, and interestingly enough, it was Exxon that developed it. But what batteries do is they don't store electrical energy. They store chemical energy, which is then converted to electrical energy. It's very, very difficult to store electrical energy. Capacitors do it, but they're not practical. And so you have a flow of electrons from the cathode to the anode through an external circuit. And it's this flow of electrons that provides the current that actually does the work, that lights the light or turns the motor. As far as battery types, the zinc carbon, which is the old type battery, is cheap, but it has a relatively low current flow. The alkaline battery is considerably improved. It has a much longer life. And you'll notice if you buy alkaline batteries now, they have like a 10-year shelf life. So they're quite good, and they're more practical. The lithium batteries are a little higher voltage. They run about 3 volts, but they have a long life, and they're fairly stable. But we've got to do better than that. And so the next battery that's coming along will be the sodium battery. It's not here yet. It's being developed, but it's about, well, it's a much better battery. It has a greater power density. It's more stable. And sodium is available. Sodium is everywhere. It's in the sand. So it's a very abundant element in contrast to lithium. It's more environmentally friendly. It also makes a better battery. And it's not prone to fires like the lithium batteries are. It also uses much cheaper materials. So it uses aluminum, which is cheaper than the copper that's used in a lithium-ion battery. It has a higher operating temperature. It's more fire resistant. It charges faster. And it's going to be the next battery coming in the future. Well, the silver oxide battery is this little button cell that I talked about. It's high energy density, it's very stable, and it's used in everything, but especially the quartz watches and the other things that we just don't see, but it's there. The solid state battery is also being developed. And as we improve these batteries, we increase their power density, we increase their stability. I can envision one day when you'll buy an electric car where the battery would be good for 50,000 miles. You won't have to charge it, you'll just take it, you drive it. 5 years later, you'll take it back to the dealer and they'll pop another long-term battery in. And that is a potential. We're not there yet, of course, but battery technology is improving considerably. And it's improving rather rapidly. Well, the last thing we're going to talk about is online banking. And ATMs we take for granted now. They're everywhere. But they've only been around since about the early 2000s. And it goes through the computers. So what happens when you go up to an ATM? You insert your card, the ATM reads it. The first digit on your card tells the ATM what system you're using. So if the first number on your card is a 2 or a 5, you're on MasterCard. If it's 3, I think that's American Express. If it's 4, you're on Visa. 5, I think, is Discovery. Now the next 6 or 7 digits are the operating system of the card. In other words, that tells the ATM what banking system your card has been issued by. And the next 5 or 6 digits up to the last digit is you. That identifies who you are, what your bank is, and what your account is. And the last digit on the card is what they call a checksum. It's done mathematically to make sure the transaction is secure and that it's accurate. So we take all this for granted. So you put the card in, you say, okay, I want to withdraw $100. That tells the host bank for the ATM which then contacts my bank, which tells it, okay, you got it, it debits my account, and then the host bank tells the ATM to deliver my $100. Each ATM holds about 10,000 or more dollars in cash. So you now know why people are trying to steal them. There's a lot of cash in those things. Then you have more ways to send money, the so-called peer-to-peer transfer, like Zelle and Venmo, where if you have Zelle and your friend has Zelle, you can say, send them $20. It's not a terribly secure system. Zelle and Venmo have been hacked. And unfortunately, if it gets hacked, you're kind of out of luck because it usually takes money out of an account in which you have money and it's gone. Both those were owned by PayPal in 2013, and PayPal in turn is owned by eBay. And then PayPal is interesting because it was basically an escrow type of account. It was set up so you could sell something, and PayPal held the money and released it to the seller when you had assurances that you received your thing. So it gave the seller and the buyer an intermediary to make sure that the transaction went through and that it was legit. If you have a system now where your bank, say, puts money into your checking account each month, it's done through an ACH, an automatic clearinghouse. And that's what banks use. It's very efficient, it's very fast, it's secure. But if you have to go worldwide, you then use what's called a wire transfer. And this is between banks and transfer agencies. And once you do a wire transfer, you cannot draw it back. Same thing with the ACH. It's a one-time shot. So you want to make sure that everything is accurate. And when you do it, they're going to make sure that all your numbers and all the information you're giving is absolutely accurate because you can't undo these transactions. So finally, we live in a world full of electrical and electronic devices. We really take them for granted. And for the most part, they are reliable. Well, they don't work on occasion, but for the most part, they do work. They're also reasonably cheap. So the chip in your credit card really costs about maybe 10 cents. It's a passive chip, which means there's no battery power applied to it. You don't have a battery in your card. And where it gets its energy from is the device that's reading the card. So it supplies energy to the chip. It then reads what's on the chip and can send it back to the host computer. Same thing with your RFID tag, which stands for radio frequency identification. It's a passive chip, and you need a reader to find out where it is. So the Apple tag on your bag requires a reader to interpret it. Same thing with your SunPass or EasyPass or the chip that's in my cat. So if my cat gets lost and a vet has a chip reader, there's a company that knows that that chip in that cat belongs to me and Eve. So we have all these devices, and they're getting better, and they're getting more inexpensive. And we really can't live without them. We take them all for granted. And for the most part, they work well. They work hidden behind us. We're not aware of them, but we enjoy them. So if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. Yes. Oh, I think we need a microphone. And we have Bruce. Yeah. Bruce has a question.
You have a question?
I wonder if you could confirm a rumor about the GPS satellite above Gainesville. Is it true that it's painted orange and blue?
No, it is not. It does not have a Gator logo as far as I know.
Thank you.
Yeah, going back to the batteries, I was surprised that you're so very optimistic about how batteries are going to develop in the future. I think you mentioned the sodium.
That's right, the sodium battery and the
then that
solid
was going to be
state.
much better. And then you said something about the solid state
Right.
battery. which, so it sounds fantastic to me that we could make those kinds of developments in the future.
Well, think about how fast battery development has been recently. You know, your cell phone has a flat battery in it. Batteries were never flat before, and yet they make them in these different shapes. And so we have lithium batteries, which can be made in different shapes, but we have other batteries that are going to be developed that will have each succession of batteries has a higher energy density and seems to have better characteristics as far as charging cycles and other things that we look for in a battery. We're trying to make them safer. So we're going to go beyond lithium because they have a tendency to catch fire. It'd be nicer to have a battery that doesn't. But, you know, each successive improvement, and it's coming rather rapidly when you think about how long it's been since the dry cell battery and the lead acid battery. So I'm optimistic. I think it's exciting to see all this come down the pike, and I think we're going to see it in our lifetime.
I thought the world was running out of sand, so I'm wondering about how they're going to get sodium for the batteries if there's not enough sand.
Oh, I think there's plenty of sand. Sodium is one of the most common elements around, so we've got sand everywhere. I don't think we'll ever run out of sand. They're worried about running out of lithium, but not sand.
Yeah, I think she was talking about silicon, not sodium. Silicon is part of sand.
Right, well, it's silicon oxide, silicon dioxide.
Yeah, okay.
So,
I still have clients.
Mhm.
Thank God. But they pay me now electronically, and a Zelle payment can be done within seconds.
That's right.
And I could be on the phone, and the person says, I'm sending you the money now. Okay, I go check my bank, and there it is, while we're on the phone.
Well, think of how fast it is for your ATM transaction. You know, and that's going to at least 2 different computers, including the one at your bank. And so Zelle is simply, you know, another means of transferring money. The problem is that Zelle and Venmo are not that secure. And so they have been hacked. So you have to be careful with them. In other words, don't keep that much money in your Zelle account. Yes, you have to be careful both ways. In other words, anything that's electronic probably can be hacked. Now, with your credit card, you're protected. You're only legally liable for $50, but that's not true for your debit card.
So I'm trying to get over my fear of asking really stupid questions in public. But I really want to know, did you say that only 6% of our electric energy is generated by hydroelectric dams and things?
Yes. In other
So
words, 80% of it is from a steam turbine. Now, steam is produced by either burning coal or oil or nuclear, but we're still about 80% with turbine-produced power. Now, the hydroelectric also is a turbine, but it's the waterfall that's turning the blades as opposed to steam.
So if we freed all the rivers around the world, we would only lose 6% of our electric energy?
Yeah, well, you've only got so many waterfalls that you can tap. You know, you've got Niagara Falls, you've got some of the major waterfalls, but most of them, you know, are kind of nice to look at, but they're not powerful enough to set up a hydroelectric plant. And the same thing with solar. We have a lot of solar out there, but it's a minimal amount. And the same with all the wind turbines. There's still a relatively small amount of the electrical power that's being generated. So we have a long ways to go to be self-sufficient of, you know, burning fossil fuels.
Anybody else with any questions?
No.
Okay.
Tesla had a concept for transmitting power wirelessly, which I just didn't work out. But how did we get from wires to radio waves? Was that Marconi that basically
Yeah, Mark,
came up with that concept?
right, well, Marconi figured out how to do it. And the original radio set used a spark gap to generate the carrier waves. It was a very messy type of transmission, but it worked.
Yeah.
When you think about it, that was the only way to communicate to ships at sea or across continents, was to use a radio wave. I remember when I went to work in Algeria, my phone call went across the transatlantic cable to talk to even America. Now it's all satellites, it's all radio. And the cost has come down considerably. That telephone call for 3 minutes cost me $1965. And when I talked to my daughter in Australia, it cost me $1 a minute. And it bounced off God knows how many satellites. Any other questions?
No other questions?
Well, otherwise, thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. It was great.
Yeah. What can I say? It's